I think I gave everybody a good second to settle. Sophie, would you like me to kick us off? All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the virtual day of the NC Live annual conference. We're excited to have you join us online today. You are in Press for Poems, creating and deploying a DIY poetry dispenser machine in the library. If you're looking for a different virtual session, you can find the Zoom links on the Sked and on and on the conference website. My name is Rosa. I'm the moderator for this session, and I'll share a couple things before we begin today. So at NC Live events, we value the presence and active participation of all attendees. By joining us, you agree to uphold the principles of our code of conduct, which can be found on our website, and I will add that link to the chat right now. So in the interest of time, we'll save the Q&A for the end of the presentation. But if you have a question, you can put it in the Q&A box, which can be found in your Zoom toolbar at the bottom of the screen. I'll be monitoring the Q&A and the chat in case anyone needs any assistance. Please make sure that you stay muted during the presentation. And this session is also being recorded, and the presenter's slides will be posted after the conference if you'd like to access them later. All right, so now I'm pleased to introduce Josh Rakower and Sierra J. So Josh is the undergraduate experience librarian at Western Carolina University. He had previously worked as a librarian at Trocaire College and Buffalo State University. He also worked briefly as a mall Easter bunny. He holds a master's degree in library and information science and educational studies and a bachelor's in communication. His research interests focus on how to add levity into the library and classroom. Hi, Josh. Sierra J is the undergraduate support library technician at Hunter Library in Cullowhee, North Carolina. She's a first-year MLIS student at UNC Greensboro, where she also earned her bachelor's degree in information science. And Sierra enjoys traveling, thrifting, and dabbles in photography. So I will let you two get started. If, like I said, there's any questions, feel free to use the Q&A and chat, and we'll keep track of that. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you so much, Cass. So thank you so much for joining us all here today. And so Sierra and I are going to talk to you a little bit about one of my favorite projects I've worked at in the library, which was our poetry machine. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we came up with the idea of putting together a poetry machine that we kind of just made as a DIY project, and how we ended up deploying in the library and the pros and cons of taking a DIY approach. So let's start off with, okay, button, do your thing. There we go. Okay, so how many of you have seen something at another library or conference that you wanted to bring to your own library but didn't think that you would be able to implement? And this is something that's happened to me a number of times, where I see something really, really cool, and for whatever reason, whether that be that it's cost prohibitive or we didn't have the space for it or the staffing, kind of whatever reason that is, I didn't really feel like it would be something that we can implement in our library, but I just thought it was just so cool and really just wanted to do that. And for me, that happened about 2 years ago, where I saw this short edition short story dispenser at another library when I was at a conference. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the short edition short story dispenser, it is basically a little kiosk podium that you can press a button and it spits out a short story. There's a couple of different buttons for the 1 minute version, a 3 minute, 5 minute poem. Short story. And it's awesome. It's really, really cool. It's also way out of the price range for anything we could afford at our library without getting some sort of grant or anything like that. So I saw it, and my coworker came over with a bunch of short stories, and I thought it was awesome. And I was trying to think, well, could we do something like this in our library, but for cheaper, right? Is there a cost-effective way we could do this? And I thought about it for a little bit, and I came up with a basic idea, and that idea ended up becoming our poetry machine. And the poetry machine is this little device right here. Here is a another copy we have right here. So this is our poetry machine, and it works pretty simply. You press a button like that, and you wait a couple seconds, and then it spits out a poem on a piece of receipt paper. So kind of a similar idea to the short edition, just done a lot more simply, right? It's not as pretty looking, but it does get the job done. And you get a little poem printed out on a piece of receipt paper like this. So here's just a couple of examples. I find these lying around my house and my desk all the time now. And you get a little poem. It's pretty simple. So I just want to take a little sidestep from this for just a second to kind of talk about why we might want to have a project like this, right? So for me, it started very simply as that, I thought it was cool and wanted to do it because I thought it was cool. But you have to kind of have if you're going to invest time and money and effort into something like this, you need something a little bit more substantial, right? If you're going to start investing that much into the library. So for me, this kind of comes down to this concept of levity, right? So levity is this general feeling of lightness. It includes humor, laughter, playfulness, amusement, cheerfulness, those sorts of things. A lot of times it gets used as a synonym for humor, but it's actually just this more encompassing idea. And I first got interested in levity because I have always used humor as a communication style. I'm Jewish, so it's very much a cultural thing for me. It's an anxiety coping mechanism, but it was something that was really important to me, and I started researching how to incorporate humor. And till I sort of kind of got asked, "Why are you incorporating humor?" And I thought, well, here's all this research on how it helps with liking and understanding and memory and all these things. And then it started to kind of to fall into this idea of levity, this kind of larger, more encompassing concept, right? And there's not a lot of research specifically on levity. There's a lot of different elements of levity that get researched, like humor. And a lot of the research on levity that I found actually falls into the business literature, surprisingly. And a good way to think about it comes from this book that I found, a quote from this book, The Levity Effect. And it's not so much about being funny, it's about being fun, right? So it's more than just funny, it's this idea of fun and lightness that you're adding to things. One study that I looked at that measured levity, that looked at levity and actually measured it, they kind of looked at it in a mixture of humor and whimsy. And originally, when I read this study, I kind of resented it because the idea of measuring whimsy was just kind of depressing, right? Like you think about whimsy, like what's the opposite of whimsy? Whimsy, I think, like kind of trying to take it in a lab and kind of measuring it. But the longer I've kind of worked with this, the more I've kind of thought of this as a good model for thinking about levity, right? So if I kind of implement a project into the library that I feel like is adding levity, usually it does fall into broadly into humor or whimsy, right? Like if you're looking at a poetry machine, there's nothing funny about that, but there is something kind of whimsical to it. It is kind of like unexpected and kind of fun and uplifting. So even though I kind of have a little bit of resentment towards this study, I do think if you're kind of starting to try to think about implementing levity into your work in the library, kind of having that framework in your head isn't a bad way to think about it. So why would we want to add levity? So it's a way to help build rapport with our users, right? If you're adding fun things, it's a nice way to kind of work with them and add kind of that lightness to our interactions with them. It can provide a little bit of a stress relief for our users. So a lot of our projects we found do help kind of provide stress relief for our students. So there are little projects that, can kind of distract them for a minute or two, but not going to take away from their overall, work that they're doing in the library, right? So it's just a quick little distraction, help relax them a little bit before they can go back to work, right? Like with the poem machine, they come in, they press a button, they get a poem, right? And it also can help support the wellness of ourselves in the library. We have a lot of fun where we get to see students interact with these things. We interact with them ourselves. So it helps kind of be a de-stressor for us and helps our own mental health and wellness. And they also can kind of become a thing to help encourage visits to the library so they can become an attraction on their own. So let's just quickly, before we move back into the poetry machine, I just want to kind of highlight some of the levity projects that we've employed in the library. So one of our most popular ways we've employed levity in the library has been our therapy dog visits. And we do kind of try to pick out like times that people would be under a lot of stress. So we've done post-election day therapy dog visits, a very stressful time for a lot of folks. This year, that dog did a lot of heavy lifting for a lot of our students, staff, and faculty in and outside the library. We've done game nights where we've run D&D sessions in the library and miniature painting. We have our board game collection where we've kind of leaned into a lot of the fun of different kinds of displays we can have. And there's a lot of reasons to do game nights in the library and, have board game collections. And, some of that could be, community building, helping students make friends. There's a lot of help, gives us an opportunity to interact with the students, but a lot of it is just adding this feeling of lightness, right? We have our study help cootie catchers, research help cootie catchers that Sierra built for us, where they're little cootie catchers where you do the little cootie catcher thing, where you put in the color and the word or whatever, and then you kind of open it up, you get a nice little study tip. And then just a slew of passive art projects that we've had in the library. We've done rock painting, we've done make your own sensory toy, make your own paper bag puppets. We've done miniature canvas painting, and then of course on the left-hand corner, these weird little homework buddies that we made, which were my my department head had these little leftover pieces of wood from her wedding and said, here, maybe you can do some programming with these. And I felt, well, maybe we can get some googly eyes and some paint pens and students can have some fun with it. And we went through hundreds of them. It was one of the most surprising things I've ever had, where within just a couple of weeks we had just tons of them. And originally students were taking them home, and then they started leaving them there, and we had to end up doing an adoption event so we can get rid of them all. Um, so yeah, but there's just so many different ways you can add levity into the library. And if you're watching this presentation and you see the poetry machine, you think it's cool, but you don't think it's something that you can implement, I hope you can at least come away with this idea that adding levity is something that you can do too. So let's go back to the poetry machine. So let's start with the main thing. I saw this thing, I thought it was really cool. Um, so what did we want to do? So I said, well, what we wanted to create. So we wanted to create a Raspberry Pi based device, which I'll talk a little bit about more what a Raspberry Pi is in a bit, but just kind of simply, it's just a little tiny computer, right? So if you look at the poetry machine, it's this little thing right here. So it's just a little tiny computer that can dispense short works on thermal paper at the push of a button. So there wasn't really a lot that I had really established, but that's basically the general concept. You have some sort of device running a program, and it somehow spits out that on a piece of paper when you press a button. So when we were getting started, there were a few things we needed to figure out. So the first thing I needed to figure out was, could it be done, and are there similar projects available, right? So I figured I've seen enough Raspberry Pi projects out there that I figured this was something we could do, but I really didn't know for sure. So I had to kind of look up to see if there were other similar projects, and ideally, if hopefully there would be a project out there that I could just copy, so that we wouldn't have to kind of figure out everything else on our own. I had to figure out what materials were needed, right? We knew that we needed a Raspberry Pi and a thermal printer, but I didn't know what kind of thermal printer. I didn't know what if there were going to be other things that were going to be needed in there. So what were the materials that were needed? How much would it cost, right? It's one thing to do this for, something that we can maybe use some end of year funds for or something along those lines. But if the cost was going to start to build up with different materials, it's very easy for these sorts of projects that you think might be simple to start costing a lot of money. So how much would this cost? And then, of course, what types of works would we print, and how could we source them? So if we had, purchased a a short edition, that comes with a library of poems, short stories and other works that you can kind of source from. We didn't have that. We don't have that if we're kind of doing it ourselves. So we have to think about what kind of works could we use, right? So now I want to talk about the Raspberry Pi. So to kind of understand how this thing works, you need to know what a Raspberry Pi is. So a Raspberry Pi is very simply, it's a small, cheap computer. They're originally created for educational purposes. The Raspberry Pi Foundation, Raspberry Pi Company, I believe, it started off as a nonprofit, the Raspberry Pi Foundation. I believe they're now a private company with a not-for-profit arm to it. But the idea behind these machines was that they would just be the very, 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 very basic computers that could run Linux, and that students could learn to do computer science while using them. So they're very simple. They run a version of Linux. You can have it run a few different operating systems, but kind of by default, it runs a very simple version of Linux. So basically, with this poetry machine, even though it's not hooked up to a monitor, it is running basically like a desktop computer, right? So there is just sort of this, it is just a Linux computer that's running some programs. And they are very versatile and great for hobbyists. So they became very popular with hobbyists. There's all sorts of different projects you can run in there. Some fun ones, some more practical ones. I used to use one as a print server for my 3D printer. A lot of people like making little miniature game consoles out of them. So like little retro game consoles. So there's just a million and one different projects you can do with them. And here's some similar projects that I found when I was doing research to see if there was anything similar that I could do with the Raspberry Pi and a thermal printer to do something similar. And I didn't find a poetry machine or a short story dispenser, but I did find some fortune tellers, which are very similar in the idea you press a button and it shoots out a message. I also found this really kind of neat little Polaroid camera type thing where you has a little camera in there and you press the button and it spits out piece of paper. Unfortunately, these projects do use a different type of thermal printer called an Adapai thermal printer that is no longer in production, so we couldn't use it the same way we would for our project. So we had to kind of do something a little more different. So what is our home machine made out of? So first off, I wanted to kind of have this all priced out for y'all in case you wanted to copy it. But with all the tariff stuff going on right now, I wasn't really sure what the prices were going to be by the time I actually presented this. We were able to build ours for under $200, and I still believe that you can kind of get that price around that price range, but I didn't want to kind of tie any kind of real price to it. So when I'm talking about kind of price ranges, I'm going to talk about like how much it costs for us. So we used a Raspberry Pi 4. They're up to Raspberry Pi 5 now, and I believe they actually just did decrease the price of the Raspberry Pi. I was just reading about that the other day. But with tariffs, again, I don't know how much it would cost. A Raspberry Pi kit, so you can buy a kit with that's more than just like the motherboard. So it's just more than just the computer. So it actually comes with like a case. It comes with heat sinks, a fan, and an SD card. So everything is run off a micro SD card. That's how the operating system runs. All the different cables, all those different things, and that'll cost you about $150. If you want to buy the Raspberry Pi just on its own, it's I think about $60-$70 just for that. We got an 80 millimeter thermal receipt printer. So it's just the same thing you would see at a store. If you go to a cash register, this is the exact same thing. We got an 80 millimeter because it is one of the wider standard formats that's available. And we did get one that has a little cutter in there. So that way we didn't have to worry about students trying to rip it and pulling it with them or anything along those lines. So, but it's nothing really fancy. We used buttons and extension wires. So there's a button in there, right, that you can press. And then we got some extension wire in there so that we have a little bit more playroom in case we needed to work with this at all. And just you need to make sure that you have a female connector in there that can connect to the pin board on the Raspberry Pi. But other than that, you can kind of choose whatever kind of button that you'd like. There's a housing. I designed this myself using a program called Tinkercad, which is a very basic kind of CAD, 3D image design software. I'm not particularly good at designing things. So this is just a kind of a triangle, little hollowed out spot with a place for the cords to go. Wasn't even really good enough to size it right for the button. So I just used a drill. I just took a hand drill and drilled right in there. You need thermal paper. So you'll need thermal receipt paper to print everything out on. We purchased BPA and BPS-free thermal paper just so it's a little bit more environmentally friendly. There's no issues with health impacts or anything like that. So we tried to go as green as possible because again, it's not too wasteful, but there is a little bit of waste that's generated with this. So we wanted to make it as healthy and eco-friendly as possible. And then lastly, there's you need a USB thumb drive. This is where we keep the actual poems. So you can just kind of plug it in and out of the Raspberry Pi. This is really convenient because if we want to change up the poems at all, we just have to unplug it and plug it back in, right? So technically you don't need a USB thumb drive, but I think it's probably the easiest way to do it without connecting it to the internet, which creates all sorts of issues with security and things like that. So how does it work? So basically, like I mentioned, the Raspberry Pi is it is like basically a desktop computer, right? And it's set up to run the Python script that you see on the right-hand side right over here. And we will be putting this up on GitHub soon. We're just kind of editing out some of the documentation so this is something that you could copy a little bit easier. But if you wanted to copy this script yourself, you could do that. And we have it set up with something called a cron job that's designed to run the script when you start the Raspberry Pi. So when you turn it on and it boots up, it immediately plays this script. And what the script does is that when it detects the button press, it goes into a file on the flash drive and it pulls a random .txt file, which is the simplest type of text file you can have on a computer. So it grabs the random TXT file and it sends it to the print queue. Like I said, it works just like a regular desktop computer. There's a print queue that it puts all the print jobs into, and then it prints out the print job. So it's pretty simple. Unfortunately, even though it's really simple, because we took this DIY approach, it can still run into a lot of issues, right? So unfortunately, when you do a DIY approach like we did, you do run into issues that you wouldn't necessarily have if you bought a product that was already developed and designed, right? So some of the issues we've had are that diagnosing problems can be tricky and really time consuming, right? There's no manual that we can consult. There's no tech support we can go to. We have to figure out what's going on from the ground up every time, and troubleshooting those problems can be pretty wasteful. So here's a picture of my desk after we were having some issues where some print jobs weren't printing out right, and I had to go and test it out over and over and over again, and we wasted a lot of paper doing that, right? There are some problems with the available drivers. So just like any other device you would plug into a printer, sorry, a computer, this printer needs drivers to work and to run. And because this isn't necessarily like a popular project out there, there aren't a lot of drivers that have been updated and worked on. And one issue we've kind of come across is that we get these weird little characters at the top of the print job sometimes, and we don't truly know what's causing it. But based on what I've been reading from some forums, it sounds like it's an issue with the drivers themselves, and we don't really have the know-how to fix those. So there's really not a lot we can do about it. And if this was a popular project, there could be a community out there that would be working on these sorts of projects to kind of come up with better drivers, but it's really not a priority for anyone. So we're kind of stuck with having this issue, and there's not a lot we can do about it. Processing print jobs can be slow. So, the print jobs print out usually takes a couple seconds, but it can take, anywhere between 5 to 30 seconds, but we don't have a light blinking or anything to show you that anything's happening. So if you're sitting there we have it deployed at our circulation desk. And if you have it at our circulation desk and you go over and you walk and you press a button and nothing happens for 5 seconds, you start to wonder what's going on, right? We use standard receipt paper and printer. So we're not using anything, proprietary. So we're stuck to the limitations of what these printers can do and the size of this paper, right? So the short edition dispenser uses a wider piece of paper, but this is what's kind of standard for receipts. It works really well at the grocery store, but for us, we're kind of limited on how many characters we can have here. So we're kind of limited to those sorts of things. And then we also need to source and format our poems ourselves. We don't have a library that we can grab from. So that's created some issues on its own. And Sierra will talk a little bit about how we actually grab these poems.
Thanks, Josh. So we wanted to talk a little bit about kind of our selection considerations when we were, choosing our poems. So the first thing that we thought about was the copyright status. So we wanted to ensure that we were properly attributing authors and we weren't, reproducing things without permission. So we chose to only include poems that were part of the public domain. So for the most part, those are poems that were published prior to 1930, or where an author who published something more recently specifically requested that their work be part of the public domain. So that really limited our scope of poems that we could use. And also, if I had any doubt about a poem's copyright status, or if I couldn't figure out when it was initially published, I wouldn't include it in the poems that we sent to our machine. The next selection consideration was the poem length and width. And Josh, you can go ahead and hit the next slide. Yep. So up on the screen right now, we have the poem that many of you are probably familiar with. It's The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. And this poem is around 100 lines long. I couldn't even fit all of it onto the screen, so it's just an excerpt up there. And that would be a lot of receipt paper. You're probably talking, probably a foot or two of receipt paper. And so we tried to consider, the length of poems. We didn't want to be printing out more than, say, 6 inches of receipt paper. And so length was definitely a constraint for us. And then there was also the physical width of the poems. So like Josh said a minute ago, we could only include poems that or the receipt paper could only have up to 40 characters of text on it. And so any poem that had more than 40 characters per line, I would have to go in and manually add spacing and stuff, which depending on the poem could really kind of mess up the aesthetic. So Josh, you can throw up that other poem up there. So for example, this poem is The Mouse's Tale from Alice in Wonderland. And it's, a really nice poem. It's pretty short. But because of the formatting, we wouldn't be able to include this in the machine because the formatting is so essential to the way that the poem reads and to its aesthetic. And I don't think that we would be able to duplicate that for the poetry machine. In addition to kind of the formatting, I also considered the content of the poems. So we work at a university and we have a lot of patrons from, diverse backgrounds, perspectives, age groups, etc. And so I wanted to make sure that we had as much representation as we could get, but also to consider kind of the content constraints of like only having public domain poems. So because these are often published prior to 1930, some of the poems that I came across had some outdated or insensitive language, or language that just needed some additional context that we weren't really able to provide in this setting. So I was really careful to kind of consider, how our different patrons might respond or think about a poem, whether it would be encouraging to them or maybe something that would be offensive or, that they wouldn't enjoy as much. So those were my selection considerations. Let's talk about my sources a little bit. Next slide, please. All right, so the first source that I used was Project Gutenberg. So Project Gutenberg, as I'm sure many of us know, has a really large collection of digitized public domain books. And a lot of those books are like poetry anthologies. And so Project Gutenberg provided a really good source to find, those public domain poems. There were a couple of disadvantages to that. So it was kind of hard to search for specific poems. So you'd have to, do scrolling and browsing through a whole anthology. It would also take a lot of like clicks and digging to get to the actual poems that I was looking at. So the next source was poets.org. Poets.org is one that I was a little bit skeptical about at first, but after doing some research and looking at some of their content, Poets.org really started to grow on me. So they are from the American Academy of Poets. And what's really cool about Poets.org is that you can search for poems and you can also filter them both by theme and by public domain status. And they also have a lot of, different authors and stuff on there. They don't have quite as many public domain poems as some of the other sources that I have, but their searching was probably the most robust of all of the sources that I used. The next source that I used was Public Domain Poetry. This is just a website called Public Domain Poetry, and it has over 38,000 poems. So it's probably one of the biggest sources for public domain poems that is out there. The problem is like it doesn't have the best searching. So you can find poems by title or author, but it doesn't have any type of like themes or keywording to make it easier to search. And the last source that I wanted to talk about was called African American Poetry, a digital anthology. And this is put together from a professor at Lehigh University. It has a lot of poetry from African American authors through 1930, and also a lot of like information from those authors. So this was a really good place to find poems to make sure that I was including, diverse perspectives in our collection. And we also, one of our themes, which we'll talk about in just a minute, but one of our themes was on Black History Month and on African American poetry. So that site specifically was a really helpful resource for that theme. So my general takeaway from public domain sources was that there's no perfect source and that you need to look in a variety of places to find poems. Next slide, please. So now we're going to talk about the themes that we used. So for much of the year, we had kind of a general collection of poems that were sort of evergreen and could be used in any situation or season. But we did try to highlight and have different collections of poems around a specific theme for different seasons, observances, etc. So the first one that we did was Black History Month. So I found a lot of works from the early civil rights movement through the Harlem Renaissance, and we highlighted this last February during Black History Month. And then last fall, we did spooky poems. So Josh and a few of our colleagues did a Halloween task force last fall. So they did a lot of programming around kind of the Halloween season. And as part of that, we did spooky poems. So I found a bunch of poems that were everything from like kind of mild horror to like just slightly spooky fall themed poems. And that was one of my favorite themes, honestly. The next theme that we did was winter poems. which has one of my favorite puns, the Welcome the Frost pun. We initially had thought about doing holiday poems over the winter, but we ran into two issues with that. First of all, most of our students are not here during kind of December, early January, the holiday season. And also, again, one of the disadvantages of sourcing public domain poems is that it was quite hard to find, poems that represented the whole spectrum of holidays and that weren't just around like Christmas time. So we kind of pivoted and chose to just go with winter themed poems. And then the last theme, which is what we have right now, was works by WCU poets. And I don't want to steal Josh's thunder because he's going to talk about that in just a minute. But I did want to highlight it's one of the things that we're working on. Next slide, please. I did want to talk just very briefly about the keywords and searching terms that I used. Again, like it really depended on where I was looking. Some of the sources like poets.org had really robust ways to search, but not all of them did. And so I ended up kind of, searching in different places and just Googling and figuring out, the best ways to search for poems. So I learned a couple of things. The first one was finding different eras and time periods that fit into the themes that I was looking for. So for example, for the, Black History Month, I found a lot of poetry in the Harlem Renaissance. Or when we were highlighting spooky poems, a lot of poems from the Victorian era, because the Victorians sure did like their death and darkness and spookiness. The next one we had was synonyms. So things like, for winter poems, searching for snow, for spooky poems, searching for Halloween, etc. And then finally, finding specific poems who fit into kind of the theme or the niche that I was looking for. So I found for spooky poems that Emily Dickinson was a really good source because she has a lot of poems that are like a little bit spooky, but like they're not like full-blown horror, and so they're like perfectly appropriate for like public consumption and stuff. So a couple of examples of poems that she published that are kind of spooky is like, I felt a funeral in my brain, and then one need not a chamber to be a chamber to be haunted. So those were some of the keywords and searching terms that I used, and I'm going to hand it back over to Josh, and he's going to talk about the student works.
So when we started putting together the Poetry Machine, one of the advantages and things I wanted to utilize it for was a way to showcase student work. And that was a little bit trickier than I thought it was going to be. We've had this up and running for about 1.5 years now, and we just started getting student works featured in there. So it was a little harder to get faculty involvement than I would have expected, largely because when I would kind of start chatting with them casually about it, they were a little confused about what it was. If you tell someone we have this poetry machine that spits out poems, they get a little confused. But once they see it, it became a little bit of a different story. So I was fortunate enough that there was a faculty member and instructor I was working with. We were doing an instruction session in the library, and she came up to me and was like, "Oh my God, I just got a poem. This is the coolest thing." And I said, "Hey, about that, would you want to get your students to publish poems on there?" And she also just so happened to be the faculty sponsor for the Creative Writing Club. So initially we were going to get the Creative Writing Club involved, and the students were very excited about that. Unfortunately, we scheduled that meeting with them the day that Hurricane Helene hit. So that ended up taking a back burner, and we're going to get set up with them again next semester. So that unfortunately got a little diverted. But she also was teaching a creative writing class. So she made as an assignment the students to write a poem for the Poetry Machine for the creative writing class. And a lot of the students were pretty excited about that. It was a way to, kind of get something out of their work, right? So they're actually creating something that would be out there that other people can see. And it was a lot of fun. And of course, not every student was excited about it. And we let them publish their works anonymously if they preferred, or use a pen name as well. But a lot of them got a kick out of it. So I think she'll be doing that assignment again. So that was a lot of fun. The only issue that we really came up with that was that there were a lot of formatting issues. So normally when we have a poem, Sierra will send me the poems. She'll format them herself, and they're all perfect every time. When the students sent us our poems, even though they were sent into TXT files, we had all sorts of weird issues where they wouldn't print, and I have no idea why. Again, that's kind of the problem with the DIY approach. And so I had to kind of just end up rewriting them into TXT files on my own for some of them. So, but other than that, which wasn't, it was just a couple hours to kind of fix that up. So other than that, it's been really great, and it's been kind of a cool way to showcase student works, and I'm hoping that we're going to be able to continue to do that. And now I'm going to hand it back over to Sierra to talk about some of the impacts that we've had from this poetry machine.
So we wanted to conclude our presentation by kind of talking about the impacts that we've had on our campus community with this project. First of all, it is pretty difficult to collect hard data about this. So we don't have a number of like how many poems get printed a day, or like, whether students are using it versus faculty and staff. But we do have observations. So I think Josh mentioned this earlier, but our poem machine is at our circulation desk. So it's like the first thing that people see when they walk in, and our circulation staff can kind of monitor and see what's going on with it. So I work in circulation, and I also interviewed a couple of my colleagues who also work in circulation, just to see, what we think about this project and what the impact it has had on our students. So a lot of students, when they see it, they're like, oh, what's this about? It prompts a little bit of interaction with the library and conversations with staff. They want to know how we built it, where we got the poems, etc. And again, it's like the first stop when you come in the library. So people will come in, and like the poem is the first thing that they like do when they come in to study. And some people actually will just come in for a poem and then leave, which is really interesting. They'll also wait a long time for the poem to print, which can sometimes be awkward because like they're just standing there and we're like, can we help you? And they're like, no, I'm just waiting for a poem. And I'm like, great. A lot of our students will also use them as bookmarks. Apparently one of our students has a display of them in their dorm. I know I personally have a couple of poems that are just like thumbtacked to my cubicle walls, and they're just like there when I need them. One of my colleagues observed one of our students calling it "my sweet darling poetry machine," which, if there's one quote that could sum up the general attitude towards this machine, it's definitely that. We've noticed a sense of joy and wonder in students who discover it and come back. It's become kind of a routine for a lot of people, which is really nice. And they also seem to be really encouraged and uplifted by it. One of my colleagues said that it really lifts people up a bit if they're having a rough day. It kind of introduces, what Josh was talking about earlier, that sense of wonder, that sense of levity and curiosity. And it does create like a small but noticeable impact on our environment and culture. It cultivates that sense of curiosity and levity. It's something that's inspiring for people. And our students really love it, and so do we. So next slide, please. That was everything we had for y'all. We hope that this presentation has, sparked your own sense of curiosity and wonder, and has gotten you to think about ways to maybe introduce levity in your own library. And I think we're going to transition into taking questions now.